G'day everyone, we are back to talk about spiritual growth. If you haven't seen the first video in this series, go back and check that out. That really sets the groundwork. But before we go into any detailed stuff today, I just want to share a story. At the beginning of this year, I really felt like I needed to refocus and look ahead into the future and work out what I wanted to do with my time and my focus so I could use the year really well. And I felt like this year that was particularly important. Maybe it turns out that was true, but I decided to go on a fast. I'd never done anything this dramatic before, but I decided to go on a 5-day water fast, which is not fasting from water for 5 days. That would be like a terrible idea. It's fasting from everything but water for 5 days. And during that time, I had an incredible day on the very first day. I was a little bit bummed that the other days of desperate hunger weren't so rewarded as the first one. But anyway, the first day was really something because I just had this vision in my mind, this dream to go down to the ocean and look out at the ocean and pray and just wait on God and see what happens. It was sort of a romantic idea. So I got in my car and I found a beautiful spot. I'm reasonably close to the coast here, which is awesome. And I found a great spot. I got out of my car. I started walking towards this spot. I'm like, yes, this is the place I was dreaming of. And as I was walking there, I kind of, maybe in the recesses of my mind, I knew that I was already turning this into a project. I was going to do this special thing and find this seaside formula and invoke the presence of God. And I just felt God prompt me to stop and look down, like to slow down, to stop and look down. And I was still walking, right? So I obeyed that nudge from inside and I looked down and I saw all of these stones around my feet, the kinds of smooth stones that you get around the seaside. And immediately it was like these stones started speaking to me or unpacking some kind of spiritual message that was obviously something that God was trying to reveal to me. And it was very simple. It was basically the lesson. It was like a little parable that these stones, these smooth seaside stones, would not have started out smooth. They would have started out by breaking away from some larger rock or being some fragmentary piece before they were worn down into this nice smooth thing. And of course, the process of smoothing down a stone is just the process of being washed in and out, rolled over sand and then back over sand. And the motion of the water and the waves constantly in and out every day just brings about that smooth shape. And that is a very obvious spiritual lesson. And it really blew my mind that on day one, and this was the highlight for me across these 5 days actually, but on day one, I did have this beautiful moment of realization. Now, the value of that story, of course, is in just thinking about our lives and ourselves as being like seaside stones. Now, how do the stones become smooth? How do they become good seaside stones, right? That if you can imagine like a bad stone or a good stone, it might sound strange, but a stone on the seaside that's kind of not doing its job is a stone that is hard and flat or jagged and angular and puts up a real fight when the water flows in and out. And that's where all the foam and all the trouble comes from, is from those rocks that are kind of hard facing the sea, and the sea comes up and bashes them in the face and they spray all their spray back at the sea. I don't think those rocks have a very good time. And I don't think the water has a very good time dealing with those rocks. But these smooth stones, they're beautiful. And the relationship between the sea and the stone is very mutual. And I know stones don't seem to have any consciousness or anything like that, but you know what I'm saying, right? So as I thought about this, I thought, wow, in order to become a smooth stone, let's talk about spiritual growth. These stones only really had to do two things. And this was all just unpacking in my mind as I looked down and looked at these stones. The stones only had to do two things. They had to be in the right place, by the seaside, the place where the water's going to wash you in and out and the sand is going to smooth you down. And they had to be there for a long time. That's it. 2 ingredients. Being in the right place and staying there. So I felt at the beginning of this time of fasting and setting my time aside for prayer and reflection, I really felt that this was the nugget that God wanted me to hold on to. Put yourself consciously in the presence of God and stay there. Incredibly simple, incredibly old-fashioned advice. I'm obviously encouraging us not to think about sort of hacking spiritual growth, right? Because we're all obsessed with making optimal use of our time and getting as much as possible out of every single minute of our days. But in terms of our growth in our whole conscious life before God, there's just no substitute for being consciously in His presence and being there for as long as possible, spending as much of our time as we can in that place. Now, that actually does mean that we need to rearrange our lives a little bit if we want to experience that conscious experience with God. It doesn't mean that you need to clear 2 hours in your calendar to sit in a room and do nothing but pray. Actually, I think the ideal, which we're going to talk about along the way, is that everything that we do is done in the presence of God. And as we kind of retrain our minds to live in reality, the reality of the kingdom that's been revealed to us, washing the dishes can be a deep moment with God. Mowing the lawn, pruning your plants out in the garden. It doesn't matter what it is. So this is kind of where we're headed. Excuse me. But that's a little story that I think can shape what's ahead. Now, there's an interesting thing to notice about that story. Let's think about who I am, right? As a person, I've got to try to think objectively about myself here. I am a person who helps to run a Christian mission organization, right? A mission organization. I literally tell people about Jesus for a living. I get on planes to tell people about Jesus. So if we're talking about how Christian a person is in their focus and the way that they spend their time, if we're thinking in the obvious ways about that, then I should maybe be a pretty Christian guy. But the interesting thing about that 5-day encounter, or 5-day attempt at just slowing down my squirrel mind and leaning into God, was that I got one really profound moment. That was the moment with the stones. And then I got a nudge a couple of days later. I was laying in bed very tired, which happens when you don't eat anything for a long time. And I got a little nudge to pay more attention. And it completely came out of nowhere, so I fully believe this was from God. To pay more attention to our country's Indigenous history, to read about it, to learn about it, to care about it, and just to think on what God might want me to do about that. So I did. I dug into that, and it was heartbreaking and tragic, and I'm still kind of working through, God, what do you want me to do in my local community and however else? So that was the only other thing. I had the stones thing, and I had this nudge to start really caring about our Indigenous history. But in 5 days of not eating, that was the big stuff that happened for me. So I'm trying to be very honest in this series and not present myself as some kind of, guru who's got everything together, because I'm not. But I just hope somebody out there might be encouraged by that. If you've got some feeling that there are all of these super spiritual Christians who just encounter constant stream of God's consciousness beaming into their minds, and they just get conversation with God flows like a river. You know what? I'm not mocking that. I would love to get there, and that's part of the journey that I want to go on in this series. But just be encouraged that I am a very spirit-filled, committed, deeply loving Christian who shares the gospel for a living. And even when I carve out almost a week to not eat and listen for God, I get a couple of big nuggets, and that's about it. So if that makes you feel a little bit better, that if you don't have that experience of constant words from God, then I'm glad. Let's normalize this. Let's realize that we're all very much more in the same boat than we realize. And if we are headed towards that constant conversation with God, let's not imagine that that's what most people have. My experience is that we don't. We want to get there. We live in a time and a world in which that is very hard. And we're all sort of figuring that out together. All right, great. So where do we go from here? If we do have this common experience we desire it, we believe that it happens. Where do we go from here? This is where I want to turn to my old mate, Dallas Willard. And he has so much gold to share about our common experience of wanting to hear from God and what happens when we lean in. And let's just read a couple of passages from that. The funny thing that happens in this book is before I even got started on like the stuff that I wanted to talk about in this series, I found this passage that I'd read the first time I went through the book, and it just knocked me for six both times. Both times I read it. This is just painfully true for anybody who's come out of like young adulthood. I'm in my mid-30s now, so I look back on my teens and my 20s. For anybody else who's looking back on younger years, this might hit you a little bit hard. Listen to what he says in the introduction to this book. In the bloom of youth, we just do what we have to do, or whatever turns us on. How simple it seems. Often we are not even conscious of having chosen anything. But after having collected a few disasters and learning that actions are forever, that opportunities seldom return, and that consequences are relentless, we hungrily cry to God, "Thy will be done on earth as in heaven." That is painfully true of my youth and young adulthood. I basically just made a really big mess several times over again and found myself at the end of it saying, "Okay, God, I get it. You win. Your will be done." Anyway, so that's kind of a gut punch moment from Dallas Willard, but it's painfully true. Now, after that, he opens the first big section of the book with this awesome, simple insight, which is what I want to focus on in this video. There's this kind of tension that he unpacks that all of us probably feel. It's a little bit like what we were speaking about earlier on with our common experience. But often we haven't acknowledged this tension. On the one hand of this tension, we have a very overwhelming account in history and in stories that we might have heard in church or wherever else of people hearing from God. And they're not all just some bunch of quacks. They're not sort of people who are off with the fairies. These are solid, thinking, feeling, believing people. If we look through the New Testament and through history, we've got Jesus himself, very obviously, but he's got a bit of an advantage, being the Son of God and everything. But then if we just keep going, and even if we ignore the voices of the New Testament, which we shouldn't do, we find ourselves in history coming up against names like Augustine, Teresa of Avila, St. Francis of Assisi, Martin Luther, George Fox, John Wesley, Spurgeon, Phoebe Palmer, D.L. Moody, Frank Laubach, A.W. Tozer, and Henry Nouwen. And these names are not the names of people who are just kind of wild mystics. These are mostly people who are deeply thinking, intellectual contributors to the history of Christian thought. And these are people who, when leaning into the presence of God, have found his presence to be deeply there and deeply consistently there. The incredible thing about these people, these particular people who are only a tiny, tiny subset of the list that we could talk about, is that they have mostly come to a point in their lives in which the presence of God just does seem to flow like a river. And if we want to get there, first let's just realize that it can and does happen. Again, this is like a tiny subset of the people we could talk about. There's a countless list of people, including present people. You probably know some who do deeply experience the presence of God in their lives. So we've got that on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, and I'll just quote Dallas Willard to talk about this one, we also find a pervasive and often painful uncertainty about how hearing God's voice actually works today and what its place is in the church and in the Christian life. Now, how true is that? We're usually just not super sure how it happens for people, how it feels for them, and it's hard to even trust, sometimes it's hard to trust that it's even a good idea for people to be hearing from God and making decisions based on that. Now, that's a mistake to think that way, but it's easy to think that way because all of us have seen this idea of hearing from God being abused in some really tragic ways. Like maybe you know some stories of people who heard from God to do a certain thing or whatever, and they were just flat out wrong. And in the end, it was all very damaging. Personally, for me, it's usually the people who are most certain that God is speaking to them about big and bold things that they are called to do, I'm sometimes most cautious of those people because they're sometimes the people that we see in the news in a few years. So that, what we're talking about here, that is no small tension. We have on the one hand, an incredible account in history and in the present of people truly hearing from God, people who seem to be deeply trustworthy, reporting that as a very deep experience and sometimes even a constant experience. And then on the other hand, we all pretty much feel like we're not there yet and we're not sure how to get there. And we even maybe have a bit of uncertainty about whether it's a good idea. We have like a wise caution in the back of our minds that we should probably tread humbly and carefully. And I think that's absolutely true. So let's just return to my encouragements from the first video that at this point, brutal self-honesty and humility are what we need to even get started on this journey. If we're going to avoid the pitfalls of that second part, we need to just be humble and open and vulnerable. And we've got a real opportunity, right? It's real, but we have some uncertainty about how to get there and even some good caution. So we're just going to take our time and be honest. Now, it's probably a good time at the end of this video just to think about our own motivations. Like, why do we want to hear from God in the first place? Why did you click on this video, for example? Like, that's a good, honest thing to think about. Is it actually about a relationship with God? Is that deep down? Do you feel like that's really what you're seeking? You're convinced that God is good and loving and relational and his presence is real and you just want to live with him in the world? Or is it actually maybe about some personal advancement, being all that you can be as an individual? Maybe some grandiose vision to be the one who hears from God and is seen to be the one who hears from God? Personally, it's been my experience that this passage is so true when it comes to our relationship with God. God resists the proud, actually, but gives grace to the humble. So again, I'm on and on about humility, and I will continue to, because I do think it's like the master key to our spiritual growth in one way. A lot of these practices that we're going to be talking about along the way that put us in the presence of God and allow us to hear from him, they are streams of grace. So remember that passage said he gives grace to the humble, but he resists the proud. And my experience has been that if we want to be in those streams of grace, we have to start from that humble starting point, or the streams just don't flow. Again, that passage kind of says it all. All right, we'll leave it there for now in this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about how hearing from God actually comes in lots of different forms, not just this idea of divine words coming from heaven and entering our brains. It's broad, it's wild, it's big, it's beautiful, and I can't wait to talk about that. So I'll see you then.